Right, so we'll kick off. I'm Stacey Meadwell. I'm the National and Sector Editor of Estates Gazette. Thank you for coming along. This debate is going to be discussing community-led development, why it's important and what value there is in it for the property industry. Our panellists, we've got 3 panellists. They're all going to be doing a very, very short presentation each. So I'm going to get them to introduce themselves when they come up, and then we're going to go straight into a Q&A. We're going to be asking for questions from the floor throughout. So if you do have a question, just pop your hand up and we'll make sure that gets asked to our panellists. So Todd, do you want to start?
Thank you, Stacey. My name is Todd Lundgren. I am the Executive Director and Regional Practice Leader for CallisonRTKL for the UK and Europe. CallisonRTKL is a global design practice, and we've been fortunate enough to do some exciting projects in the last few years in Manchester, leading to us just after MIPIM last year opening our Manchester office. So we're proud to be part of the Manchester design community and really see some tremendous opportunities to grow our practice in Manchester, really focused on a lot of the values and vision that Manchester has, and how the topic of this panel, embracing community, how important that is to design. One of the things that we've noticed is often in the UK, development, and whether it's in buildings or infrastructure, seems to be very sort of engineering driven. Identify the problem, solve the problem. Oftentimes you solve the problem, but you don't do it in a broad enough vision, and oftentimes you create additional problems as a result of that you haven't really anticipated. You see that in the housing conversation. It's about quantum of housing. It's all about numbers. It's not about the quality of housing. It's not about anything more than just build X number of homes. And it's a classic quantity, not quality conversation. And I think quality needs to be part of the conversation in order for us to capture this notion of embracing community and the value that does bring. If we strip it down to just bare numbers, oftentimes we talk about, I can manage supply chain. We can look at enhancing procurement. We can look at different ways to deliver. But it's all about solving a particular problem. And what you see in a lot of property developments is singular developments, almost gated communities, isolated from their surroundings, from their context, and really not building a sense of community. And sometimes even the planning and Section 106 processes almost become development box ticking, and a lot of times may not have that broad enough vision to capture the sense of community. So we must change the way we think about development. It's not about buildings so much. It's not about bricks and mortar. It's about places. And it's about thinking about place from the very beginning of the development process. It's not just, here's the brief, here's how much building we have to build, here's how many units we have to build. It's how can we use that to enhance and add to the broader community. It's really looking at a more sustainable way of development that builds value. And we'll talk about how we build value through that in a second. Well-designed places actually solve a lot of the problems that exist today in terms of antisocial behavior, in terms of isolation and loneliness, division of people, security and safety. All those things can be addressed through embracing community and not development. The best new places are going to actually use public realm and use that to enhance a sense of place and build community amongst a diverse group of people. This is a case study from Calgary, Canada, 1,100 unit development. And it highlights 2 really sort of key things about the way you need to think about embracing community as you go through design and urban design and architecture. First, it's really, before you start designing, it's about understanding who you're designing for, thinking about the community, the people that are going to use it, what they value, what they want out of their lives, where they want to be, what kind of things they want to be doing, what activities they do. So there's a tremendous amount of demographic and psychographic research that goes into identifying who is going to be using these developments. The second thing is about diversity, and diversity not just by uses, which exists in this project, but also diversity in terms of the different types of users. This is a project that had 3 different demographics that we focused on to develop a specific design around. And then you curate that experience around each of those demographics and look for areas where they overlap and where they connect. But each user has things that they want, they desire, and then they have the ability to mingle and connect through the public realm. And there are 3 completely different types of residents and completely different units designed for them and different amenities that are offered, and really an experience curated for each of those types of residents. So diversity and mix of uses is hugely key in this. I think the last thing is it's very much, building community and creating community is very much research-based. We've done a lot of research in our business, and we're based as an urban design practice that also does architecture. There's a lot of research that we've done globally around mix of uses, scale of spaces, height of buildings, density, all of those things. And what we found through that is there's some common themes. One is build on standard urban forms. People understand traditional urban forms, and they really desire that. When you get too crazy and too different, they're not comfortable. So look at streets and squares and look at how you develop a range of privacies from public to semi-public to semi-private to private. Maintain a front door and a street relationship. It goes a long way to creating active frontages, to building a sense of eyes on the street and security that makes people feel comfortable in a community. Mix of uses and mix of tenures, and walkable public realm. It's very important to think about almost public realm first, buildings second in a lot of respects to create this sense of community in place. And then lastly, it's about shared streets. It's really important to balance car and pedestrian behavior. You don't want to separate them necessarily, but you want to balance them and let spaces be used for both. You don't want to exclude cars, but you don't want to separate and define public pedestrian ways and public streetways. And then the last thing is permeability. You can't have these communities be separated from the other developments. And part of the thing that we need to see more of is collaboration between developers, because I think permeability and letting people come into projects and through projects is really a key part of building that sense of community. So in conclusion, I think embracing community is about curating experiences for different demographics that you're seeking to attract to your development. It's creating sustainable solutions that bring people together rather than drive them apart. And it's developing a long-term ambitious vision for our cities that develop an easier planning process that's more cohesive. We think of it as a win-win-win. It's a win for the resident because they have a great place to live and to work or to play. It's a win for the developer because if you do these things, there's proven data that shows that community developments drive premium rents and premium returns for developers. And it's a win for cities because they become known as a great place to live. Stacey, thanks.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ken Knott, sit on the board of Select Property Group, been there for the last 3.5, 4 years. Prior to that, I was the founder, shareholder with 2 others and the chief executive of Ask for 13 years. And in that period, we delivered over 3 million square feet. But fundamentally, Ask was a property development company. And the process that most development companies go through is to secure a piece of land, identify a concept, and then go through a process of design, development, construction to maximize its value. But at completion of that development, or often before, most developers will sell the asset they've created, and it's what most developers try to do. My experience at Select in the last 4 years leaves me in no doubt that that conventional approach to property development is perhaps obsolete. In fact, you could argue, just to spruce it up a little bit, that conventional property development destroys communities. Why do I say that? Well, having been in both camps, the interests of the developer are simply not aligned to the optimum long-term performance of the asset. And that's a disconnect which has huge consequences at the design, development and specification choice stage. And you see examples of this all over our towns and cities. At Select, the approach is we are a global developer, retailer and operator of market-leading brands. And the key words there are the operator and the brand, because it's about innovating brands through research, as I said earlier on Circle Square, that align customer needs with investor returns. But actually, the primary goal isn't the investor, the primary goal is the customer. And embracing community is pivotal to that goal. Developers who embrace community take a long-term perspective, bring much greater value to a city, reduce development risk, and maximize the value of an asset. But let me look at a case study to illustrate the point I'm making, and it's one of Select's most successful brand, its Vita student brand. Vita Student recognized 5 or 6 years ago that modern students were not getting the accommodation they wanted. In this country, we have a world-class higher educational infrastructure, over 100,000 international students, but the development industry was delivering, as the slide shows, third-rate product, cheaply built, poorly managed, often in secondary locations. So we conducted focus groups before we ever considered buying a piece of land to find out what students wanted. They wanted a home, not a hostel. They wanted to be near a university, but that wasn't enough. They needed to be in a vibrant city centre. They wanted self-contained suites and not so much clusters. They wanted open-plan living. I'm sure, actually, they wanted open-plan living. And lots of community facilities. In other words, they wanted to be part of a community. The best jokes are the ones you don't think up. So we were trying enormously hard to walk in their shoes before we asked them to set foot in our building. But the single biggest difference of all was once the designers and the contractors had left site and the building was built, we operated the asset, and those are the brand pillars of Vita Student. And we did that whether we were selling it or retaining it. Because to deliver a community experience, we had to train our own people to manage that asset and deliver the expectation level of our customers. And all of the staff from the operational platform are selected from the hotel and retail industries, and they work enormously hard every day to make each student, no matter where they're from, feel at home in the centre of Manchester, in the case of our First Street residents. What that leads to is rebooking rates that are 60% higher than the industry average. And what you're seeing on this slide are scores out of 5 on over 80 different measures that our customers are rating the service that our operational team are delivering. It's that attention to detail, it's that obsession with customer satisfaction that is so hugely successful. But I'm a dinosaur and I've been a developer through and through, so Select has been a learning curve for me. And what have I learnt? Well, the First Street residence is an amazing value accretion story. It was funded in 2013 through off-plan sales to investors. The banks wouldn't support it because it was an unproven product. So we induced investors by offering 7% yields, 5-year guarantees. That generated a gross development value of 30 million to fund the development. We then let it September 2013. The operational team moved in, 100% occupied, huge waiting list, and we delivered 12% rental growth at the beginning of the second year. We recognised we'd sold the asset at undervalue. We then went through a process of negotiating to buy it back. It took us 9 months to do it, off over 200 investors. We paid 32 million to buy it back. It's fully let ever since. It's now delivered 20% rental growth since completion, and it's currently valued at 42 million. So that's an astonishing 82% capital growth in 4 years. And that's a similar experience at our residence in Newcastle, and also our first ever Vita Student campus in York, where we have 650 suites in 17 buildings. So finally, it's all about community, 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 within the building and outside the building. And as I said earlier, developers who embrace community do 3 things. They bring greater value to a city, 7 million economic impact from our residents in Manchester, but graduates who've had a great living experience have a much higher propensity to stay in the city, so it helps to nurture and retain the talent. Secondly, we reduce development risk, full occupancy, waiting lists, rebooking rate. And thirdly, we maximise value. So I'll now hand over to Linda to conclude the presentations before we have the discussion.
All I can say is student accommodation was never like that when I was at university. I obviously live in the wrong time. Hi everybody, I'm Linda Shallor. I'm Chief Executive of MAG Property. Simple version of what I do is it is not a terminal building. There we go, I'm being told to move it on. I'm not responsible for terminal buildings or runways, but I am responsible for 640 odd million of real estate assets that sit at our airports and about 1,000 acres of development land. So as I sort of walk through this, I'm going to try and give you a perspective of a real live, very large community that is built and it's thriving today, and actually what's going to happen alongside it in Airport City. So I'm going to start with the airport. The airport is an example of a community. It's a 24/7 community. It's always on, it's never still, it's always open, and it's always changing. We have over 22,000 people working on our campus. And these range from airlines to baggage handlers to retailers, and actually to some pretty large international businesses who are starting to come in to be based at the airport. The site's already rich with amenity. Doesn't mean that we've got it absolutely right and it fits the sort of needs going forward, which means we're constantly thinking about it and how we change that and evolve that. But we have everything from retail to food and beverage to hotels, gyms. We've got a creche. We've got a multimodal transport interchange supporting not just the people who work on campus, but actually 26 million passengers who travel through that campus every year, not every day. That would be quite remarkable. We have a strong interface with local communities. You can imagine actually being an airport, we impact their roads. You know, if something goes wrong on a road, number of passengers coming into our airport every day creates gridlock. When we're going through a major terminal transformation programme, which is what's happening at the airport today, we have to plan incredibly carefully, not just with the city council, local planners, highways, but also with local communities. Noise is an issue for them, car parking is an issue for them, light is an issue for them. We work very closely with them. And actually Airport City builds further on the critical mass that we have at the airport, on that infrastructure, and actually the approach that MAG's adopted over many years to working with communities. Now, Airport City delivers an incremental 5 million square feet of space at Manchester. It's actually substantial by any standard, the standard of any development in the UK today. And the growth of the airport and Airport City over the next decade in terms of jobs is actually going to more than double the jobs on campus. So you can imagine the challenge that that brings around impact on an opportunity for local communities around us and actually the community that sits within the campus. Interestingly, over 80% of the people employed on this campus today are actually from Greater Manchester. So we have a massive sort of hit rate and actually creating jobs for local communities and bringing the communities that surround our campus actually in. And new occupiers such as Amazon, who came into Airport City last year, worked really closely with Manchester City Council and MAG to target GM residents for jobs. And of the 1,500 permanent roles that they have, about 900 are actually filled by people from Greater Manchester. And actually at the peak, they had about 3,000 people working in that facility on their Christmas peak. MAG also operates an academy where we actually work particularly with the local community around us to provide support to often long-term jobless in actually being able to apply for a role, what the skills that they need to do that, and how they can actually access roles not just at the airport, but actually within our wider supply chain and other occupiers there. And a growing number of businesses are now based at the airport, and they're not just tapping into, sort of the immediate local workforce, but actually tapping into the much deeper skill and talent pool that we have and the access to global routes. So what's it all mean for certainly 3.5 million of the 5 million square foot that's going to be built? The campus that we have today is continually evolving. As I said earlier, we're spending about £1 billion over the next decade to sort of make sure that that can continue to adapt and continue to sort of grow alongside the airline growth and the passenger growth that we're seeing. And, and the Airport City is building on this, and we're using it basically to leverage the skills and techniques that MAG have deployed, both with the communities and with the city and with the planners over the last sort of 15 to 20 years to bring that actually into the Airport City development itself. We'll provide a blank canvas. I mean, if you look at it today, there's a video later on, you can actually see what's starting to happen on Airport City. But we've got an awful lot of land. We can basically provide a mix of uses. We can create great environments. We can look at campuses, we can look at clusters, we can look at actually sort of a more traditional office CBD type of development. But really interesting, we can look at the flexibility that businesses require, not just today, but going forward. Because I think arguably, I've spent 20 years of my career client side, so I've commissioned buildings, I've brought schemes forward actually as an occupier. And what I could say if I look at occupiers today in the dialogue that we have, and it's a bit sort of picking on the theme that Ken picked up about asking and listening to what they want, their uses are probably more diverse now, or the way they use buildings and campuses today are more diverse now than they ever have been. And actually, importantly, buildings are increasingly representative of your brand. So what your building looks like, the environment that you provide, is actually a way that you not just attract but retain talent, because actually your buildings say something about how you feel about the people that work in them and actually how you are as a company. The same can be said of places. You know, quite simply, great places are places where people want to be. They want to work there, they want to live there, they want to socialise there, and actually communities that people want to be part of. And I'm sure there's something that will come to in the debate later on, but tenure is really important on that. If you've got consistency of people being transient in and out of that place, you actually don't, it's really hard to build a community because it's not sticky. But quite simply, when you're building on the edge of Wythenshawe, and with the airport community behind you, you know, you're basically looking at creating a place that lifts aspirations, that actually provides opportunities. And I think, again, to probably the last point that Ken made, I think actually a value beyond that of just the physical buildings. Thank you.
Right, I'll just fill for a second while we get some stools. Hope if you've got questions, do just pop up your hand. We've got about 25 minutes for the Q&A.
Just in case I fall off, they put me in the middle. It's not a swivelly one, though.
I want to start off. One of the things that sort of struck me listening to the presentations is about listening to and talking to the people that are actually using the buildings and using the space, using the homes and the residences. And I just wondered, because I was thinking about sort of what is driving this change, does that imply that the property industry has been very slow to actually start listening to occupiers? And have they not just done that in the past, or is this a new thing? I don't know whether, Ken, you want to pick up on that, because you talked a lot about students and actually asking them what they wanted.
I can only comment on my own experiences. At Ask, we used to pride ourselves on being highly innovative, focused on very good design, and really committed to placemaking. And I think most enlightened developers are committed to all of those things. But actually, what I have learned with Select is they don't think like a development company. They think like a retailer, they think like a hotelier. And before they even get to the discussion around purchasing land or appointing a design team, the first part of the discussion is, what's the opportunity in the market sector? Why do we think that opportunity is there? And how do we establish it? By going through the research. And that's something which we didn't do in my previous company. That's not to say that... I think the industry generally tended to be more supply focused than demand focused, and that's just historic. But what the First Street value accretion story tells me is that getting the placemaking and the design of the building and the specification internally right is only arguably less than 50% of the equation. The greater part of the equation is delivering an amazing experience to the people who use that building, and that's what drives massively enhanced capital value, not the bricks and mortar, in my opinion.
I mean, these are all phrases and words you don't normally associate with developers and property, or certainly not from the past. Linda, the whole kind of engaging with the potential occupiers, is that something that's evolved, or is that something that you think has always been?
I think it's definitely evolved. I mean, my background, I worked at BT for 18 years of my career, was last in Manchester working for the Co-op, so two significant sort of size estates. And I think actually what happens, buildings tend to be built for the institutional investor. So actually they tend to be quite vanilla. Whereas actually in both of those companies that I've worked for, I've been sort of involved in bringing forward, and because we were big and we had scale, we could do it because I actually know this is what we want to do. We always had a mind to, at some point in the future, if we wanted a 30-year lease on it, that we would need to have something that was attractive to investors and that had sort of longevity. But the reality of it is going back to the early days at BT, where we introduced work-style buildings on the periphery of the M25, and we took everybody out of London. You know, we flooded buildings with wireless. We had 30-odd% of the company working totally and utterly remotely, and another 30% working very agilely. You know, so that was really sort of quite, you know, leading out, and that was very much occupier and business driven. The co-op sort of move to One Angel Square was very much around, as I said, I said it from experience, that the buildings that the co-op inhabited before One Angel Square was built said a terrible thing about the co-op, about what it felt about its people. I mean, they were incredibly old, they were really underinvested, you know, they ranged from sort of 1860 to 1960 in age. And actually, you know, there's lots of well-founded evidence now that shows if you provide a brilliant environment, that not only does your productivity go up, your engagement goes up, your ability to attract and retain, you know, the best people goes up. And so that building, you know, so One Angel Square was designed, you know, probably learning everything that I thought was good at BT and putting that into it, but actually then sort of listening to how we were going to use the building as a business and actually creating the right space.
Is obviously we talked about the importance of occupiers. Is the increase in value, the value that you can add, is that like more of the stick for the property industry, do you think, to actually adopt this style of development?
I suppose it's almost a bit like was there a green premium or a sort of a brown levy? I mean, you're sort of in that debate, but at the point that, you know, somebody who does that, their building is infinitely more investable and more marketable, and you're attracting the right covenants. I mean, the industry, funny enough, responds quite quickly. But I do think you've got to be careful here, because there are some fantastic developers out there that are doing incredible things. And I actually think, you know, the standard has continued to be raised, and the benchmark has continued to be raised, and businesses do see themselves as being a service provider as well as the provider of space. So I think actually there's been a huge shift in the last decade to the way that places and spaces are developed, and placemaking is actually critical to that.
I think there's clearly a gaining of understanding that it's not just a spreadsheet kind of based approach to value, that there are these intangibles that do have value. There's more and more data that does that. I mean, the statistic that if you have one friend in an apartment complex, you're 75% more likely to renew your lease, and if you have two, you're 90% more likely. Well, there's a real value to not having voids and to having people stay and to building community by longevity through those things. So the more you can begin to do those things, you know, there is a tangible value. It might not be a line on a spreadsheet, but I think there's more and more an appreciation that those things do bring great value to the, as I said, to the win-win-win, the developer, the resident, and the local community.
I was going to come on to kind of the value in terms of measuring these. Obviously, Ken, you spoke about, you know, that was a very specific example and some real figures there. Are there other ways, we've talked about voids, are there other ways that people are actually starting to measure this now in terms of the actual value that it adds? Have we got close to kind of coming up with an equivalent of a BREEAM rating, or, you know, will we move in that direction?
I think you should. Which is not necessarily that we do. I was, funny enough, in a panel, watching a panel this morning in the UK sort of tent over the back there, and this exact sort of topic came up for discussion, and David Partridge, actually, who's been well known to a lot of the Manchester community, you know, was advocating that, you know, we should look to government to basically set a series of measures that measure when you're bringing development forward, that you're not just basically creating, the value is just not in the bricks and mortar, it's in actually, you know, how it impacts on the social fabric. So whether it is parks and open spaces, jobs and opportunity, you know, the permeability to surrounding communities, you know, that is actually really important, because that can have an impact on the health and well-being and the economic prospects of what's around it. So I think we don't have that yet. There are some interesting pieces of work going on looking at how you might measure that. You know, pieces of work that have been sponsored by people like Trowers and Hamlins did one last year, actually, you know, that are actually starting to explore that, but currently there isn't a framework that's actually applied consistently as far as I'm aware.
I think the theme of community is, I agree that the industry's come on leaps and bounds in placemaking, but I don't agree that the industry's come on leaps and bounds in terms of how it operates assets. I think that's where the the big opportunity is. And I can only say that because I've worked for a property development business. I've been with two businesses for 30 years, and more recently with one that views the development process as a means to an end in terms of delivering an exceptional customer experience. And it's that completely different mindset and how you approach all of the decision making. And as to measurement, I think communities historically have been at their most successful by longevity, people choosing to stay there, people choosing to live and socialize in the same environments because they are completely happy in those environments, they enjoy being in those environments, they feel secure in those environments, productivity increases, happiness increases. And we used to be miles better at it probably decades ago. And we lost our way, I think, in the 60s, 70s and 80s. And I think we're beginning to regain our way, but I think we've got a long way to go.
Well, one thing to add to that, I think we've done some work, and I mentioned a little bit of the research that we've done. This is a little bit more North American, but we're now looking at doing the same level of research here, where we look at size of blocks, density of development, mixed number of uses, amount of open space. There's about 12 different criteria that we've assessed over about 50 developments in North America and Canada. And it's interesting that the more of you can identify things that drive value, and if you get 8 or 9 of those things, those developments make 10-15% uplift in value. So we're looking to take that same methodology and now look at doing some research in the UK and in Europe, because there are metrics and there is data that does help back up the notion that value does get created. So you can counteract the get in and get out development mentality that might happen otherwise.
Any questions from the floor at this stage? Oh, okay, we'll shoot on. I wanted just to pick up, obviously, talking about adding value. Obviously, investors and funders are a big part of the property industry. And you mentioned, I think it was you, Linda, that you mentioned vanilla institutional investors liking the vanilla developments. I mean, are investors cottoning on, or are they kind of in tune to this, the value that can be added to a development that's more community-led? I mean, Ken, do you want to start on that one?
Well, it's interesting. I sat in the auditorium at 2 o'clock to listen to the debate with Marty Edelman, Howard Bernstein and Saad Lister from the HCA. And just listening to the Manchester story, more particularly why the Abu Dhabi investment company chose to make a huge investment, not just in the football club, but in the development and environment that it is, was all to do with what Manchester's achieved in terms of creating community in the last 20 years since Howard and Richard have been driving the team forward. And if you look at the city centre and its growth, that's all been about creating a whole series of different places which have different community focuses to them. But if you look at the way in which rental growth in all of the sectors and yield contraction has swept across the city, it's now undoubtedly the second best investable location in the country after London, and arguably is challenging that now in terms of value for money. And that's down to the community-based focus of the City Council.
And I think so. I think investors have definitely got their heads around placemaking. And it's just to echo something Ken said earlier, and actually you don't see major developments being brought forward today without fantastic public realm and amenity. That's sort of that's entry level. I think, have they got their heads as a sector of sort of the property world around community? The answer is I'm not quite sure, because I actually think in the same way as an occupier, I felt we actually really had to drive and push, despite being told what we should have, for what we actually wanted and what we knew was right. I think actually what you start to see is this is where the public sector have a really important role to play, to talk about how they want their cities to be, how they want that structure to work. And they are hugely influential, working in partnership with the private sector. And you'll see time and time again sort of instances where the track record is really important to actually get sustained and continued investment from investors. So, and I think actually that I was watching it as well. I mean, that's very evident in terms of what's happened in Manchester.
Was that one of the key challenges for this type of approach, or what are the other challenges in terms of if you want to do a community-led development? What are going to be the biggest hurdles to get over in order to achieve that?
One of the things that I think everyone needs to think about is really just a different way of collaboration. it's one thing to do a large scheme and collaborate with the council and the local government, but to collaborate with the developer next door or across the street to try to make something greater out of the whole rather than compete with those. That kind of collaboration, the more of that can happen, I think you're going to see even a broader uptake on embracing the sense of community.
And I would say don't underestimate. I mean, for my sins in a former sort of role, I tried to bring forward an eco-town, and that was probably one of the most bruising experiences ever, where we did community engagement on a level that, you know, you can't even think about, and probably 900 people out of 400,000 actually sort of managed to stop it. But you know, so don't underestimate, you know, sort of the need to engage all of the stakeholders really effectively, and to actually find something that's cohesive that they can actually, you know, sort of all get around, you know, as the idea or the concept. Because actually, just in this instance, we were providing schools, we were providing health centres, we were providing housing, we were improving transport. It wasn't enough because we were building on a former airfield that was surrounded by fields. And, you know, so actually there is a really sort of, I think one of the biggest challenges is actually making sure you've got something that your stakeholders can actually sort of coalesce around, and that is big enough and important enough to actually enable you to develop it.
So is planning an issue? I mean, is it geared up for this type of development?
It can be, but it depends where you're doing it, and it depends what you're doing, actually. You know, so doing something in Manchester, I would say you probably receive more proactively as long as it's seen as being accretive to the city and it's adding value, you know, to the city and the experience of being here, than you are in some other parts of the country.
I would say the single biggest challenge is to stop thinking real estate and to start thinking customer experience, and sort of refocus the analysis about what makes an asset perform to its optimum level. And actually, it's about delivering the highest levels of customer satisfaction, because if you do that, it doesn't become about price, it becomes about an experience. And that's how you maximise the value of the asset. And I think I'd include myself in this, the industry, for all too long, the development sector in particular, thinks in terms of design, development and real estate, and not necessarily starts with the end customer focus.
And we talk a lot about curating experiences. And, you know, when you think about the commercial space at the ground level around a PRS development, you could sit there and say, well, these 5 tenants, I can get the highest income from those 5 tenants, but they might have no relationship really at all to the tenant residence that you're going to have. You could take less rent to curate the right kind of tenants that align with the values of the residents and ultimately get higher uplift on the overall development. So sometimes less is more, actually, and you know, there's a little bit of a belief system in that, but to Ken's point, I think thinking long-term about curating experiences is something that I think drives the success of this.
Well, we held back a commercial unit in the First Street building, which initially we thought it was part of the planning mix and it would get let to Pizza Express, but we just felt nervous that actually that wouldn't satisfy the customer that was in the building. And we held it back, and ultimately we've joint ventured with a very successful independent operator called Laundrette, and we've opened a laundrette in First Street 3-4 months ago, and the students and our customers are in there all the time, spending heavily. It's added very much to the experience of them being in our residence. So that wasn't the best yielding outcome for that particular A3 unit, but the value accretion it will have delivered to the development as a whole is much greater than if we'd have let it to Pizza Express at £35 a foot. And that's a decision based around being absolutely clear about what your customer wants rather than what's perceived best value.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot to learn from what the really great retailers have been doing. You know, you talked about hospitality, you know, sort of hoteliers. Actually, if you look at the airport, I mean, as part of the massive investment that MAG's making, we've mapped our customer journey. So from the point somebody decides they want to go on holiday, what are the touch points and the interfaces to them coming to the airport, parking the car, going through security, getting on a plane, you know, sort of coming back, and the journey in reverse. Because actually what's really important to us, that is all about the customer experience. So our investment mindset is actually thinking about what is this going to deliver in terms of customer experience. And I do think that actually does drive, you know, that makes people want to come, and it does make them sticky.
Any question at the back?
John Platt, the Plastic Surveyor. I was just wondering whether or not the financial crash of 2008 has enabled developers such as yours to be able to pursue the way you're dealing with it. That you're getting investors, presumably into your business, who are looking for a long-term income and therefore prepared to invest for a longer-term future. And the traditional role with banks and institutions who wanted it built, let and flogged off as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point, John, and it's lovely to see you. I've not seen you for years. That correction, which was horrific for most in the industry, heralded a sea change in, I think, investment approach. And Linda alluded earlier to, for too long, institutional criteria had, if you like, been too dogmatic and had stifled innovation and dynamism within all sectors, I would say. And that's not a criticism. I think it's a matter of fact. You had to build your you had to build your office to BCO standards, grade A spec. You'd put all this kit in, and the tenant would come along and rip it all out and throw it away. And it was just, it was bonkers. There was so much waste. But I think with Select, we're trying enormously hard to move from a forward sale model to a build and hold model because of that First Street story. We were giving so much value away. So the buildings we're now doing around the country for Visa Student are being funded through debt and equity. And we're looking to develop value within the brand as a going concern as opposed to within the real estate asset. You've got the asset underpinning the balance sheet, but it's the brand proposition where the value lies. And my view would be that more enlightened investors want to get involved with those businesses who are very customer and brand focused because it reduces the risk to them of voids and it enhances the prospects of rental growth.
Another question over here.
So Ken and Lydia, you were talking earlier about how we're really good at placemaking, but not so good at managing operations for buildings or building operations. I'm wondering why is that, and how can we step change and scale that? Because it makes sense for many reasons: energy consumption, carbon, health and well-being. But in the industry, we see spreadsheets, we see annual data points for buildings, even for very large assets.
Well, in utopia, it'd be like Disney, and you'd own everything and manage everything, and it'd be a wonderful experience. But, you know, for decades, the development industry has brought forward projects with a view to de-risking throughout the development process, letting the asset, selling at completion, taking the development profit, recycling the capital, and moving on. So, in reality, when they're sat with the team making key decisions at the design development stage, there is inevitably nowhere near as much focus on the life cycle performance of the building or indeed the public realm as there would be if they were going to own that asset for the long term. That's my view. And the industry isn't going to change. It's always going to have many developers, very bright, entrepreneurial, dynamic. And I think it's probably up to the public authorities to lift the bar and make sure that if that is how the industry is going to be bringing projects forward, then like we've seen in Manchester, look at how the bar has been raised in the last 20 years. It's unbelievable. So no matter whether you're a developer or a long-term investor, you've got to deliver a certain standard.
I think there's two quick points. I think when it's driven by an occupier, in my experience, actually, they do look at whole life costs. That's really important to them. They particularly look at how they reduce energy consumption, how they can occupy buildings more efficiently, and actually the flexibility, so you try and future-proof the space because businesses change in shape and size, they're changing the way they use space continually. And again, I think you've got more of that happening today than we've actually seen for quite a long time. So I think it depends who's driving the scheme. If you are an occupier, you commission it. And I've written many a business case on the basis of, you know, the savings from a whole life cost perspective being a big contributor. Then that's the end of the telescope you look at it from. and that goes back to making sure that developers understand what occupiers are looking for if it's circular. I think the second bit is actually about the technology that we don't deploy yet as standard in the industry. So actually, you know, sort of the technology that we embed in the product that we build that can actually measure, can monitor, can report, can collect and analyse the data, and actually can then sort of enable sort of adjustments to be made and reset. And I think actually that's probably one for the next 20 years in terms of that becoming standard, you know, good practice, and it will be, and for it to be deployed economically, because fundamentally, as a developer, you know, you have got to make an acceptable level of return. You know, so at the end of the day, you know, sort of things will be done a way they've always been done. If you can't see a new way of doing it, it's actually going to give you an acceptable level of return.
We're out of time, unfortunately. It's such an interesting topic, and I've still got loads of questions I wanted to ask, but unfortunately that's us. So if you'd like to join me in thanking our panellists.